So welcome everybody to another awakening conversation. And today I have with me Kelly Surtees, an international astrologer, teacher, writer, and consultant. And at the end of this conversation, she'll let you know where you can find her. So welcome, Kelly.
Thanks, Sarah. It's so exciting to be with you in this format.
I know it's pretty exciting for me as well. I've been really looking forward to having this conversation. I think I contacted you a couple of months ago and you said,
yeah,
my first date I'm available is the 4th of June. And I was just like, lock it in.
I know I'd forgotten that we set this up, and then I was really looking forward to it, which is fantastic. There's so much to talk about. 2020 is a very unique beast in terms of the astrology.
Well, that's kind of why, I mean, I saw you for my annual astrology reading that I do with you as my gift to myself in January.
Yes.
And I remember you mentioned this, I mean, this is January, well before anything happened in Australia and just as things were happening in kind of China, really.
Which means in the Western world, we were not paying any attention at that point.
Oh God, no, not at all. And I remember you mentioning like these 3 big planets and it's going to be something big and it's going to affect the globe, but I'm not sure how it's going to play out yet. And when all of this started happening, I'm just like, oh God, you know, I wonder what you were talking about. So maybe you can start with that. Or what
Absolutely. Yeah. So what we were talking about. So there's a few different cycles that are unique to 2020 astrologically. The biggest one that a lot of astrologers have been looking at is Saturn conjunct Pluto, which was happening in Capricorn in January. And that's a cycle that only happens about every 40 years or so. And it's a cycle that speaks to kind of destruction and rebirth, the idea of things being pulled apart or disintegrating and then remade in a completely different, totally new format and structure.
Yeah,
right? I mean, and sometimes we do find that little challenge in astrology where we can see symbolically, these are the symbols that are being activated. This is the type of cycle. So this is the tone, if you like. This is the terrain. It's rough over here or bumpy over there or dark over there, but we don't always have the specifics. And so there's those sort of pieces we sometimes dance between. But the sign that this Saturn-Pluto alignment was happening in, or did happen in, is the sign of Capricorn, which is a sign about tradition and established structures and old centers of power, if you like. So it's very much like the tearing down of the old ways that don't serve the new paradigms or the new world. And the other huge cycle that's happening in 2020 happens in December of 2020, and this is to do with Jupiter and Saturn joining together in the sign of Aquarius. And it would be too simplistic to say, oh, this is the dawning of the age of Aquarius, because those ages are quite difficult to date specifically. But there is a cycle that was used in traditional forms of astrology where the Jupiter and Saturn alignments, which are known as conjunctions, and this one's known as a grand conjunction. And it's the start of a new 20-year cycle, but it's also the start of a new 200-year cycle.
Wow, I just got shivers.
Yeah, it's huge. So the shift is out of the earth element, which has been the last 200-year cycle. And earth is about matter and the material world and the body. It's also about money and mining and things like that, the industrial sort of revolution that's gone on in this last couple of 100 years. We're moving into the air element. And air is about movement. It's about things being more mobile and flexible. Historically, this can sometimes involve invasions where people that have been established in one geographical place start moving around into other places. It also has a nomadic quality to it. But in the most recent air cycle, which was, when I say recent, we're looking at 800 years ago, we're looking at like late 12th century, 13th century, 14th century, in history. Things like paper manufacturing happened. And so the idea of paper manufacturing to that time in history was what things like mobile phones and the internet are today, because it allowed wide dissemination of ideas and information.
Mm.
Unfortunately, one of the other things that we did have in that time frame was the Black Plague, because air is about dispersal of things, and when that's dispersing ideas and information, of course that can incite revolutions or changes in collective awareness and thought. But if we're dispersing things like viruses or bugs or bacteria, that unfortunately leads to things like plagues and pandemics. And so these are some of the things that are part of the transition, I think, into this new energy. And 2020, I know a lot of people were like, it's the start of a new decade, yay. And all the astrologers were like, no, it's the end of so many long things. We're not doing our fresh starts and rebirths in 2020 yet.
Yeah, right. Gosh, there was so much in
that. I know, I feel like I just gave you a lot, Sarah.
That's okay. No, that was all really, really interesting. The one thing that I was thinking when you said that, like going even from like that kind of earthy material money, even, I don't know if I can put this on it, but masculine energy, like that kind of and, you know, money and power and that type of stuff.
Well, yeah, I mean, and historically all of that power has been held by men, essentially, in that time frame. Yeah.
So I wonder if like that kind of moving into more flow, if we're going to see more women come into power as well.
That, I mean, yeah, I can see that kind of quality of flow being a little bit more feminine in tone. There's another cycle, because of course nothing happens in isolation in astrology, that does speak more explicitly to women and changes in women's circumstances. And that's the cycle of Uranus in Taurus. And that cycle began 2018, when we started to get the first rumbles of that, and that'll last about 7 years. This cycle will go till sort of 2024, 2025. And I will let your listeners know that 2024 to 2026 is a huge transition period where we're going to have things like Uranus move into Aries, Neptune move into Aries, Uranus move into Gemini, Pluto will move into Aquarius. So all the big outer planets, the big longer generational planets will change signs in. But we'll talk before then to give people more info about that. And
well,
until then,
what does that mean?
So it basically talks about new world cycles starting, major changes. The Uranus in Gemini cycle, which is the 2024, 2025, that it'll start. It's about an 8-year cycle. Historically, that has been linked to revolutions, particularly in France and America. I know it sort of feels like maybe that's going to happen sooner. So we just have to.
Maybe it's going to be long. Maybe
it may. Yeah.
I mean, what's happening, particularly in America, has been such a long time coming. I hope that, what's happening now is kind of the end of such a oppressed era. But yes. I can't see it changing overnight. So maybe
it absolutely, yes. Things do take a long time to change. I mean, if you even think about things like the women's movement, the time from women getting the vote to gradually increasing their pay and their place in society, I mean, that is still an ongoing thing. So yes, I do think it takes people who are marginalized or oppressed, it does take a long time to reclaim, if you like. But in terms of right now, yeah, Uranus in Taurus, Taurus is a very feminine sign. It's ruled by Venus. And when we've had historical cycles of Uranus in Taurus, we've had breaks in social traditions or social etiquette that have allowed more freedom and independence for women. Sometimes this has been the development of things like the sewing machine or the washing machine, which if you were the woman in the home doing the laundry, that would take you most of the week. And then all of a sudden there's a machine and that job is now being done in an hour and a half.
Yeah, wow.
And so that was a type of revolution for women. The bigger one was the last time we had Uranus in Taurus was around World War II, and there was a lot of developments in food technology and food processing, which also reduced the time women had to spend in the kitchen, for instance. But also with all the men off fighting the war, women were allowed to take jobs in the workplace, and that was something that there's some thought that the sort of women's liberation movement of the 60s, that was driven by the daughters of the women who were allowed to work while the men were away at war in World War II, which was when Uranus in Taurus, the last cycle we had there. So there definitely is a strong cycle happening that is talking about changes in the way the feminine is seen and perceived and valued in the world. And there's almost like an undertone, but I think it will become increasingly overt about women's style or a feminine approach being more valued in the world.
Wow. And so what do you think of, like, just in that context and what you're talking about, what do you think about New Zealand's Prime Minister Jacinda Ardern?
So, it's funny because she seems to be doing an amazing job. It's wonderful to have such an outspoken and also young, she's relatively young to be the leader of a country. And it's lovely. I think it's fantastic. I think we need more fresh voices, more different voices leading countries.
And she has such a feminine approach. Like, she really holds this beautiful space in that strength and leads from like that real heart and compassionate space, which, is I haven't really seen that before, the way she kind of operates. And it's in such contrast to like Donald Trump in America at the moment. It's like such contrast. So that kind of almost fits with that energy that you're talking about.
Yes. Yeah, it does. It does. And I think the difference is sometimes women rise to the top and feel like they have to play men at their own game. And other times, I think that's what you're sort of alluding to. Jacinda Ardern is one of those examples where it seems like she's bringing that more feminine quality to the senior leadership table, it's so refreshing to see.
Yeah, absolutely. It's lovely.
Yeah. It'd be nice if we could have that in Australia too.
So I want to talk a little bit about like predictability this year. Like, you've talked about December being kind of a pertinent sort of time. I heard a couple of months ago, I heard you on something. I can't remember exactly what it was, but you mentioned May 16 and how on May 16 things were going to lift a little, like not totally, but they were just going to feel like that. Yeah, it was just lifting. And literally 2 days before that, like here in Australia, they had lifted like the lockdown.
So that's bringing in, so then, let's come straight back to what's happening for the rest of 2020. How does the first half of the year shape the second half? So what that was speaking to was an interaction between Mars and Saturn, which was longer than usual. Mars was literally in like this cosmic lockdown state. And that typically happens there's like a 6 weeks period every 2 years where Mars gets like restrained or contained. But this year, because of the sign change by Saturn, and Mars was in this lockdown for 12 weeks instead of 6 weeks, if you like. So that Mars-Saturn, it's technically called a co-presence, started mid-February and it finished on May 13 or May 14, I think. And so that seemed like a no-brainer that if Mars was going to move out of this connection to Saturn, which is a planet of restriction and limitation and being held down, that we would probably be able to move around a little more freely after that Mars kind of change. Now,
so we were in lockdown when Mars was in lockdown.
We were, exactly. Yeah, the world, and I mean, Sarah, you and I have never lived through anything like this before. We're both in our early 40s, and this was, you and I both love to travel. We're definitely used to moving freely around, the geography, not just of our local environment, but the globe. And so there's that. So to look at the rest of 2020, part of it involves looking at what is Mars doing and how is Mars going to be interacting with Saturn again, if he is. And Mars does. Mars spends 6 weeks from late August to early October in a different kind of, but also difficult angle with Saturn. And so whether that's a second wave, whether that's the kind of hitting home of economic problems that, one of the things that a lot of astrologers also talked about for 2020 was the difficult economic energy. And that had a lot to do with Jupiter being in Capricorn, Jupiter being the main planet of wealth, and he's just in a really uncomfortable position this year. And that doesn't bode well for general economics and money. And we've seen that in a more extreme way, that, you know, we physically were contained in our homes, and some of us were in a position where we could order things online, but things like restaurants and sporting venues and music concerts, I mean, those industries are absolutely decimated, and many businesses in those fields will never return, you know. The airline industry, which is a Jupiter type of industry, and also the education industry, whether we're talking mainstream public education, whether we're talking university education, whether we're talking personal development type education, where people are attending, you know, workshops and weekend-long trainings. None of these things are able to happen. And that's all affected by Jupiter. Jupiter will be in, I don't know, Sarah, is this too much? I feel like we're like just going into everything.
But maybe stop there for a sec, because I want to ask you about what's happening, because you're in Belgium at the moment.
Yes.
And you recently moved from Canada to Belgium.
Yes.
So you are very much the globetrotter. And what's it like in Belgium for you and your friends in Canada?
Yeah, so it's Belgium, you know, we're very close to Italy and Spain, where there's been a huge devastation with the pandemic in Europe. So Belgium, we described it that Belgium went hard and it went early. As soon as the World Health Organization declared the pandemic, which I think was March 12th, Belgium was shut down within 36 or 48 hours.
Wow.
And by shut down, I mean schools were closed, restaurants were shut, you could go to the grocery store or the chemist. That was it.
What about airports and borders?
Closed. When they shut everything. Wow. Even within the EU, where the EU countries have a similar relationship to Australia and New Zealand, where you can have free travel across the border. Yeah. The EU border countries, like we have not been able to go to France or Italy, you know, so Belgium is part of something that we've learned about called Benelux, which is Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg, and they have a very close relationship, those three countries, but even those borders were closed as well. So it's been as restrictive here, I think, as it's been in some ways even more restrictive than it was in Australia, because even practitioners like chiropractors, for instance, they were all closed for about 6 or 8 weeks. So small businesses, you can imagine, have really struggled. There has been some relief from the government, but similar to Australia, you know, the relief is just a basic sort of thing. It's not going to keep you going. Canada, Canada's so big that different parts of the country have responded a little differently. Right. They have had a lot of restrictions. Canada, like Australia, does have a publicly funded health system, so they've been able to manage it really well. The health system in Belgium and in Canada didn't get overwhelmed like they did in Italy. So we've had a feeling of safety here, even amongst, you know, like wearing masks. I mean, there was a long period there where we left our apartment to go to the grocery store once a week. We were allowed in Belgium to take a walk, but only with people we lived under the same roof. But that we could do a walk every day or two and the grocery store once a week. And that was life for about 7 weeks.
Yeah, that's essentially what we did here. But I think because the weather was great, and you know, different parts of Sydney, the beaches were shut and all that kind of stuff because people were gathering. But where we are, we're just north of Sydney, you know, we were still swimming every weekend, riding our bikes to the beach, and people were socially,
because you've got less people around where you are.
Yeah, less people. I mean, they had you know, announcements from the surf club probably every hour, you know, make sure you're using the beach to exercise, you're not allowed to stay and sit down, so keep standing,
moving,
and we sort of run up and down the beach and go for a swim. And so, you know, like, and yeah, being a chiropractor, I was part of that essential services thing. So it was more just like, you know, again, we've had it extremely lucky, and I think we've handled it relatively well. But really, it's just been a quietening down. you know, like it's just,
That's, yeah.
and I'm sure that astrologically there'd be something about that quietening down. And what I feel like is the big thing about COVID, and I don't know if this fits astrologically, I'm sure it would with the way you interpret things, but it's like, it's the we get so much stimulation and from the external, and we're no longer allowed to do that. We weren't allowed to get that stimulation. We had to go within, and a lot of people found that so uncomfortable. And I think so many people were in such different situations. If they had to go within and within the house, and they had stuff in their relationship that hadn't been dealt with, that's going to come up because it hasn't been dealt with. You know, it's like there was just so many things and of potential that were going to come up for people because of constantly being on the external and not internal.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah, that's a beautiful way of describing it, because it has the holding in place physically, as you know, and as I know, and as other practitioners know, it forces you to go deeper internally. And that quietness, I think, has been very telling in terms of how people have responded to that. And that's been really interesting. Like for me personally, I've noticed with not traveling, I saw a lot of my stress levels come down and some of the physical pain in my body. You know, I was like, how will I go with that? Because chiropractors were not deemed essential here in Belgium. It's like, how am I going to go with not seeing my chiro? And I'm like, well, not traveling, pretty okay. You know, so it's a lot of that.
The other way as well, you know, someone who's used to so much travel and freedom and you get so much out of it, you could have actually gone the other way and freaked out a bit and created a lot of stress and inflammation in your body as well.
Yes. And that's where I think people have had reactions or responses that maybe they weren't expecting. And if you paid attention, I think this has been a really rich time for gaining new awareness. And there's, you know, there are some years where there's like just one or two things going on, and there are other years where there's a lot of threads. The astrological thread to me that speaks to like unearthing hidden truths or awareness has been this 3-part dance between Jupiter and Pluto in Capricorn. And this has some very practical expressions as well, but the internal process of this is, what are the truths that are kind of in the bedrock of your being? What are the things that you don't even know are foundational in the way that you conceptualize yourself and the way that you experience the world? And having quiet time is the only way you get to those, because if you want to change them or shape them or shift them, you at least have to know what's there to start.
Well,
so there's been this,
like if we put that into context of what's happening in America too, because they've had the forced quiet time.
Yep, that's true.
Now, you know, yes, there was a catalyst, but it's like it's erupting. It's like that it's
well, yeah. And why did
the truth?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why was that event the catalyst? Why was George Floyd's death the trigger? Why wasn't Ahmaud Arbery's or Breonna Taylor's, who were other Black people killed in very tragic circumstances, you know, just in the weeks before George Floyd was? So yeah, there has been something that seems to have flipped a switch collectively, because even though unfortunately and devastatingly slow, Black people die in horrific, tragic circumstances in America, especially, but also in Australia all the time. Something has, you know, we've never seen this type of public outpouring of support and, you know, the amount of money that is moving around in support of freedom causes. And that's really, really interesting. And as you said earlier, hopefully it will lead to something substantial in terms of laws being changed, because that's going to be a necessary step.
Yeah, well, it certainly has unearthed the rubbish that's been put under the carpet, let's say.
Yeah, absolutely. And the truth about suppression and power and privilege and things like that.
A voice and not being heard. And it has actually really made me reflect on, you know, our Indigenous Australians, because essentially, like, we have had a very similar history, slightly different, but similar history that we've never really owned. You know, we've never really owned, and at some stage it has to come up for us as well. And maybe I don't know, maybe what's happening in America will help us reflect on what's happening here. And we do tend to, you know, come off the back of America with things. And maybe, you know, if a law changes in over there in America, maybe it'll kind of have an effect over here as well.
Yeah, I mean, that would be the hope. And Australia does often follow, you know, the US and other larger countries. It'd be great if Australia kind of, you know, was able to take their own initiative there. Because Australia does have, you know, very similar kind of colonial history to the US and the oppression of Native people with the Aboriginals. So, yeah, I mean, we can hope that conversations are being started that are going to lead to substantial change, I guess. But it's the shadow, or it's the real truth, if you like, coming up that people are having to address. And I think what you're sort of saying is we're seeing it at a macro level collectively, and then there's always the micro of how is this coming up for you personally as well. How are the hidden or oppressed truths in your own existence, in your own life? You know, and that doesn't have to, you know, this can be you being honest with yourself about things that haven't been working for a while. As you said, people stuck at home with partners where, you know, you can't go off and escape the truth of that. There's something one of the sort of ideas that I shared in my year ahead trainings for 2020 was this idea of truth telling, of calling things as they are.
Talking about this to people as well. Yeah, go.
Yeah, are you finding that coming up a lot, the truth telling or the truth serum kind of thing?
What I've been like feeling more strongly and talking about quite a lot is like I've realized that I have this like fundamental crazy belief that life is actually all about truth.
Yeah.
It's like life, it's not congruent with lies and untruth. And that's why that saying of the truth always comes out. It always comes out. Always. And
yes.
I heard once on something, it was like the truth is the biggest destroyer. As
yes.
in, if there's been all this untruth or lies that's been there, the truth will come up and wipe it all out because it's
absolutely
such a powerful force. And I just really believe that life is all about truth.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that is true. And I think that most of us don't realize that, or many of us are kind of deluded in, well, I think this is true, but it's not actually true. It's conditioning or it's society or culture. And to get to what is actually true requires, you know, what we were touching on before about quietness and stillness and reflection. It requires self-examination
and being able to speak our own truth. And Oprah actually still talks about it. I mean, you know, she still talks about it in her now 60s about, you know, it's like life is this evolution of moving more and more into your truth.
Yes.
And so
and I think
go.
I was going to say, I think that's true. I think it's true. God, I'm using that word a lot. To be in your truth requires courage. And I think as you get older and older, you get more courage at being able to stand in your truth, regardless of what it costs you or who it might take away from you. And that's kind of why when you see, I mean, I always admire women who are 10 or 20 or 30 years older than me. I think it's for those reasons, you know, where they get more anchored in the belly of their being, caring a lot less about other people's opinions, but they have that sense of, well, this is what's really going on, and I'm not afraid to call a spade a spade.
And I actually love that about, you know, like my grandmother died when she was 99 and her brother died when he was 100, and they both had all their marbles right to the end. And the conversations that I had with them, you know, it was like all the filters totally go. It's like, it doesn't matter anymore. They don't have to filter anything. They are who they are. And, you know, like those conversations were just my most treasured conversations because they were just so honest, authentic and truthful. And it really just didn't matter.
Yeah. Yeah. It's like, we don't need to hide. We don't need to lie. We don't need to be insecure, or, you know, our self-esteem stuff doesn't need to be triggered. This is just the truth of the matter.
How it is. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what dates have we got to look forward to in the next 6 months, I guess?
People keep asking me, when will things get, you know, a little bit more in flow again? Because I think everybody realizes, like, you know, we're heading towards some kind of new or different normal and not back to the old. And my short, very tongue-in-cheek answer is when Jupiter gets into Pisces, things will start to have more of that flow, and a little bit more of like general optimism. But that is just a 2-month period between like May and July of 2021, and really it's 2022.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
So your question, and I don't want to necessarily overly concern your listeners, but what do we have to look forward to in the next 6 months? The second half of December. We can look forward to that. Because
it's more still time, more just
I think still time,
stuff, moving through
yeah,
stuff.
moving through stuff. There is a Mars retrograde happening in the second half of the year. Mars is spending an extraordinary long time in the sign of Aries from end of June 2020 to early January of 2021. And Mars will actually be moving backwards from mid-September to mid-November. And Mars retrograde cycles have a quality of like frustration or delay, where you can feel very excited and enthusiastic, but held back or delayed, sometimes through circumstances or factors outside your control. And then within those longer cycles, Mars and Saturn are doing a fairly difficult dance for that 6-week period from late August to early October.
So in that context, that wouldn't be a time that you'd be trying to push through something just not moving. You wouldn't be, you just actually just go, it's not moving.
It's a non-movement or it's like you're either trying to do something that's so substantial and on such a large scale that it is demanding and requires effort and moves slowly. If you're trying to do things that have like this quick pop up, move fast kind of vibe, there's supposed to be a big astrology conference in the US in September. And within the astrology community, there's different schools of thought and different approaches to using the technique. And one group within the astrology community was like, why are we having this conference at this time? It is like such a frustrating aspect of like no action. And other people were like, oh, there's this one other tiny little thing and that should be okay. And other people like, that's not going to be enough. And so that's going to obviously be something online now. But to do with that, 2 other colleagues and I were looking at just doing our own event, just after in the end of September. And we spent weeks trying to find a venue, and we just kept running into roadblock after roadblock. And we had to actually say, maybe we're just not meant to do this. This is not, the right time for whatever reason. And so we just called it,
So this is pre-COVID that you were going to do that?
This was pre-COVID. Yeah, this was like for planning for these events would have been happening like late 2019.
Right, okay.
Then we're like, okay, well, yeah, that is the Mars-Saturn retrograde square. So maybe we're just trying to do too much at that time. So yeah, to your point, if you're trying to make something happen in September or October and you're hitting a few roadblocks, pay attention to them, because they're probably clues that either what you're trying to do isn't the best iteration of what your intention is, or it's just the wrong time. And the key with that September, October energy is, if something is delayed, then you're likely to get a second chance, but probably in 2021 rather than this year. Right. So, when people say, 2020, can we reinstall the program? I think we just want to skip the 2020 program and come to 2021, in the sense that, last year we had Jupiter in Sagittarius, which is this free movement, big optimism, big hope energy. And last year, a lot of people did a lot of things. And then this year, it's like we've gone the complete opposite. Last year, you were the wild horse roaming, down the snowy mountains free. But 2020, you're like the bull that's caged in the paddock, or the horse that's been locked up.
Yeah, right.
And so it is more about stillness. We talked about the end of the Earth cycle. The end of the Earth cycle is not till the end of 2020. So we're still in almost like a concentration of Earth, which as it's like a heavier, solid, slower quality. We're going to have more movement and more options next year, and even more again the year after.
Can I just stop you on that point?
Yeah.
So that concentration energy that I've also had, feel like this whole COVID situation is like concentrated and compressed time.
Yes.
So it's like people that it was like whatever direction you were heading, you know, it was like if you are kind of in your job and, you know, you're just cruising along and, you know, COVID comes along and squeezes you out of the job.
Yes.
It was kind of like you were going to leave anyway.
Yes.
It was,
yes.
for me, I was, you know, thinking about doing a podcast. I think I spoke to you about it in January. Yeah.
Yep.
I did. Yeah. So I think I was thinking about it late last year and I was like, oh, everyone's doing a podcast. I'm not going to do a podcast. And then I was like, oh, I can't shake that. Okay, I'm going to do a podcast. And
yes.
then like having that COVID period, it just allowed me to use my time in a different way because I cut down my hours a bit and people were more free, so I could contact and connect with people more easily as well. And, you know, businesses that, you know, for example, the yoga studio that I work in, you know, they had been thinking about doing online classes for a year or two, but it was just like they didn't really need to because their studio classes were great. Within the week of that being shut down, they went straight to online. It was like, it required this, it was like squeezing time, that concentration, and it just pushed people into where they were actually going.
Absolutely. I think that's such a great point, Sarah. And what it's pushed everyone into is expressions through the air medium, through the airwaves, through the internet. And that's where, you know, that period, March, April, May, June, this period is like a precursor to what we're going to have more of come the air cycle, which starts mid-December of 2020. Because everybody, and I think you're right. I know I've sort of made it sound a little bit sort of, you know, there's a heavy tone to it because there is this year, but businesses like that yoga business that you talk about where people moved quickly. If you were able to quickly transition, there are some businesses that have been having, you know, overwhelmingly busy times these last few months. So that is like a taste, you know, if you think about retail, the bricks and mortar stores are, of course, suffering. That's the earth expression. But the online iteration of that has exploded, and that's more of the air iteration, where we just jump online, order a few things, and then, you know, so if you're involved in delivery or supply or logistics, you know, that's where we're going to see a lot of movement. So the quietening down and the compression of time, it's really challenged people to think, if this is really important to me, how willing am I to get over those fears or blocks of trying a different format? And can I, you know, now that I have to, will I?
And being within that flow with air, it's like not being so grounded and like, no, this is how I have to do it. This is how I've always done it. It's like, actually, you've got to shift into that. Okay, this isn't working.
Let's just wing it a little bit.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, let's just give it a shot. Let's just, you know, plug the microphone in and see what happens, and people will listen or they won't listen. I do want to say though, there is, you asking like, what can we look forward to? The first, like the very last week of July, the first 3 weeks of August, so just coming up, you know, through the middle of the year, is a little bit quieter. We're out of the eclipse season. We're not into the fullness of, you know, the September, October, November cycle. So there is a period there where I think if people, you know, get the chance to socialize or to move around a little bit, there is a sense of tapping into that. That they can look forward to. The sun will be in Leo then, and that'll give some strength.
Okay, right. So essentially just a quiet till the end of the year, still a bit of chaos, working through stuff. Going internal is the best way to do it.
Yes.
Going with the flow is kind of, you know, the best way to approach it. If it's not working, don't push it. Just kind of loosen up and see what other ways you can do it and what's going to happen.
Yeah, absolutely. And to, you know, almost reflect on that sense of like control, like how much control do I have? Under what circumstances do I have control? Jupiter, which is our planet of hope and optimism, takes a step in a better direction in mid-December. And so there is a level of there being a lift for 2021, but the big lift really comes when Jupiter moves into Pisces in 2022, which sounds like a long way away. But yeah, for this year, it's the quiet, the stillness. The phrase that keeps coming up for me is like a French phrase which I think is mise en place, and it like means hold in place or everything in its place. And it's the idea of just being in whatever place you are for now, and participating with or acknowledging what that brings up for you.
Mm-hmm. That sounds like a really wonderful place to end this conversation.
Okay.
I think that's a really lovely message though, Kelly, you know, like this is where we're at, and accepting where we're at and being at peace with it in some way, you know, like I don't want to like forget all the tragedy and the trauma that people are going through, but it's like if we can, you know, hold that space, but also come to this place of peace within ourselves. And, you know, I think that's really the only way that we can kind of get through this without freaking out and being in a highly stressed mode for a long time.
Yeah, I think probably one little extra to add in. Yeah, there's a quality of self-regulation. We do have to like hold ourselves here. And the other piece is that the shift in the energy over the next 6 months is from the immediate and the short term and onto the long term and the lasting. So instead of trying to do 100 things right away, it's about thinking what 1 or 2 or 3 things are so important that I should be devoting my energy more consistently in longer ways. And that can apply to our personal choices. Like maybe I want to do 15 things, but it's really important that I do these 2. It also applies collectively. So if you are angered or grieved by what you're seeing socially and globally, sure, the immediate things, you know, like the posting on social media or the donating here and there, they do make an impact, but it's thinking about what will make an impact over the longer term. Yeah. How do you need to show up and vote differently if you're a citizen of a country? If you are giving money, give money every month. Don't just give money as a once off. You know, the regular donation is more helpful for the receiver, but it also serves to remind you that this is an ongoing issue and not something that, you know, just happened now and then vanishes. So that shift onto long-term and lasting, I think that maybe that's the undertone of the stillness here, is to get us out of that immediate gratification.
That long term. And I guess it's again with that kind of, with the trauma and stuff that we're seeing, it's like when the world settles and when we're feeling personally more comfortable, we don't just walk away and forget about it.
Exactly.
You know? It's like, it's still like we have enough awareness now and enough feeling around it. It's like we integrate that and we hold that so we can think more long term about the changes that need to be done.
Absolutely. Yeah. And everybody has to take care of their own physical, you know, and emotional and energetic body, because this is a long thing and you got to get up and be ready to go again tomorrow and next week and the month after. So it's managing how you want to contribute to change in a sustained way rather than in a reactionary way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful. Well, would you please tell people that are listening where they can find you?
Sure. Yes, I am on the internet. So you can find my website, kellysastrology.com, also on main social media channels like Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. I have just launched an app. So if you go into the App Store and search Monthly Astrology Guide, you will find that. Right now it's just available on Apple, but we will have the Android version up shortly. These things take some time. We've been working on them for a while and they're just, it's sort of weird to launch something in this climate. We started this process at the start of the year and it's just taken a bit longer than expected. But yeah, the Monthly Astrology Guide app, it gives you an overview of the month ahead. It gives you weekly videos about every astrological aspect that's happening so that you have all the info, the guidance, the insight that you need to help time your life by astrology. So
how amazing. That sounds fantastic.
Thank you. Yeah, we've had it running as a subscription service. So if you're not really into apps, you can sign up just via my website as well. But we thought we'd try an app and see how that goes.
Great. And again, you're doing something on moving into
exactly, into the airwaves, where I guess I'm going to see everybody on the airwaves as we get into 2021 and beyond.
Yeah. All right. Beautiful, Kelly. Lovely to talk to you.
Lovely to talk to you, Sarah. Thank you so much for having me.
Pleasure. I'll talk to you soon.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.